Although she came from an elite family, they lived in the same community with working class people in Chicago because Chicago was so intensely segregated. So she was very deliberate in creating the younger family as a working class family. She wanted them to be more representative than her family was.
I mean, what do you think you're gonna gain by moving into a neighborhood where you just aren't wanted and where some elements... Now look, people get awful worked up when their whole way of life and everything they ever worked for is threatened.
Get out.
I'm sorry it went like this.
Just leave.
You just can't force people to change their hearts, son.
The younger story is still her story, and certainly the experience of her father purchasing this home in a neighborhood that had been covered by a racially restrictive covenant, a land agreement that said no Black people can move into this community. They move in, and they are met with mob violence. Irrespective of your social class, I mean, that was really the reality for Black residents in Chicago. So she, as a very little girl, was subject to jeers and insults. Her head was narrowly missed by a brick that someone threw through the window into their house. Her mother sat in the house with a pistol on her lap to protect the household. There are various people in the community who sue for him to be evicted. The family is evicted, and Hansberry appeals, and they wind up, the case goes back and forth all the way up to the Supreme Court. Carl Hansberry wins a victory, but it's really a victory on a technicality. So the Supreme Court doesn't say, oh, it's unconstitutional to exclude Black people by these agreements, but that the agreement hadn't been executed properly. So the agreement hadn't had enough signatures from people in the neighborhood to say that they all agreed not to sell homes to Black people. So in 1940, Carl Hansberry wins this case, and Black people are able to move into the community. But it's really not for another 8 years that the Supreme Court says that it's not going to enforce racially restrictive covenants or racially exclusionary contracts, period. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act is passed, which is a much more aggressive refusal to say you cannot systematically exclude people on the basis of race from communities. And what's interesting, and I think was really powerful for Lorraine, at the end of his life, Carl Hansberry really gave up on the United States. He was so invested in the American dream, and he sort of threw his hands up in frustration and was going to move the family to Mexico. So that kind of disappointment and bitterness that Carl Hansberry felt certainly impacted a teenage Lorraine.